Hello. Hello. Hello, my name's Gavin. This is Genre Books, and it's another week of the Read What You Own challenge. Week number 11. And a bit of a failure this week. If I were just to talk about the books I've read in the last week, this wouldn't last very long. It would be rather thin gruel. But I'm going to talk about how I'm going to address this come February. For those that don't know, perhaps any recent refugees from TikTok, the Read What You Own challenge is a booktube challenge created by the evil mastermind Criminoli, and it is a challenge to readers to read a number of books from their own shelves before they will buy a new one. There are various levels, 25, 50, 100 books. There is a page count version, which equates each book to about 250 pages, if you want to go down that route. But I'm going for number of books, and I'm going for that platinum 100 book target. This is the point. I have done this once before, and this is the point where I caved last time. That's not going to happen this time, I tell myself. But I think it's weeks like this which might try my patience. I only managed 2 books during the week. I have continued to read something else as well, and eventually that will be another book, but that one is a bit of a slow burner. But let's get the books I read this last week out of the way. First is The Dark Design by Philip Jose Farmer, Volume 3 in the Riverworld series, and the largest of the books so far. This was just short of 500 pages. It felt like a longer novel as well. It luxuriates a little bit. It is a little bit more indulgent than the previous books. It is doing something different, but still with that overarching goal of finding what is at the end of the river. Briefly, all of humanity, roughly 36 billion people, have been resurrected in the river world. They come into the river world naked, hairless, renewed. Everyone is about 25 years old. Those who have lost limbs seem to have grown them back. And everyone has to fend for themselves. They get help from their mysterious, I want to say benefactors, that's probably not quite the right word. They're going to be fed. But their only enemies on this planet are each other. And we follow and continue to follow a number of people from history, some of them quite famous, a couple of them fictional, in their travails to continue surviving and to make their way up the river. We're now 30 years into the resurrection period. Until now, if you were killed in the river world, and a number of people are, you are resurrected again. This is like a computer game where, you are just back in the game starting from scratch in another part of the world. And you may be millions of miles away from where you last were, or the people you were with are likely lost to you now forever. But death appears to have returned. Normally, people would notice new people arrive in their area where they have just again been restarted. This has not happened for a year. Death now appears to be final. All 3 of the books in this series I have read have been buddy reads. The first with Aaron read a book, and the second and this one with Greg from Another Bibliophile Reads. We have another one to read. I think we're getting to that in March. The Dark Design forms part of my reading for Project Rabbit Hole, where I'm talking about lost worlds, underworlds, lost civilizations, secret societies, that kind of thing. And the Dark Design counts because it is a proper Bangsian fantasy where we are talking about the afterlife. The other book I read this week also is part of that ongoing project, and that was The Smoky God, or A Voyage to the Inner World by William George Emerson. This is a much shorter work than The Dark Design, and it's from 1908 and continues looking at the possibility that the Earth is hollow, and the way to get there is via holes at the North and South Poles. Coming out in 1908, this book probably as something trying to convince people of its veracity was fairly short-lived, because the North Pole was discovered just a year after publication, and the South Pole 3 years after that. By that point, we knew there was no gaping hole at either pole, and I should imagine this may have had an impact on sales. It's an odd framing of a book. It really does try to convince you that it's a truthful account. A Norwegian sailor, or Swedish sailor, Scandinavian sailor, on his deathbed in California relates to our correspondent of his experiences some 70 years earlier. It has a lot of footnotes and links itself to a number of scholarly and less than scholarly sources to back up the claims, but some of these claims are, as you may imagine, fairly outlandish. I'll be covering this book and The Dark Design at a later point in full when I do more videos on Project Rabbit Hole. The only other thing I have been reading this week is continuing to read In Search of Lost Time, or Remembrance of Things Past, by Marcel Proust. And it's all I'm going to be reading for the rest of today, Sunday, as well. So there is no chance to add to my book tally for this week. So that's only 2 books. It takes me to 45 in the quest to get to 100. And I don't think I'm going to get to 50 in the next week either, looking at what I have planned to read. But you never know. I might get lucky. But I might have to make my own luck in the future. Earlier this week, I was lucky enough to be invited onto Is This Thing On? With Book Songs and Other Magic and Book Blather. And amongst other things, we talked about fantasy. A few of us will be reading a lot of fantasy in February. This is partly in remembrance of Scott from the Bookish Bryants, who used to do this in February, but it's a good thing to do regardless. And what I want to do this year, I've spoken about this in a video earlier, in one of the tags I think it was, I don't really want to read any massive chunky fantasy books. Instead, I'm looking at thin fantasy, and I think in February, even though it's a short month, with some of these titles, I'm going to bump up my books read tally. So I'll just take you through some of the possibilities now. All of these following fantasy books are, I think, with one exception, 250 pages or less. So with a fair wind, I may get a few of these under my belt. And I'm going to start with some Ballantine adult fantasy. This is Lord Dunsany, At the Edge of the World, and Beyond the Golden Stair by Hannes Bock. It will be my first reading of a book by Thomas Burnett Swan. This is The Weirwoods, a fantasy from ancient Etruscan times. And another book where people are journeying up a river. This is Moonflash by Patricia McKillip. And if I like this, I also have the sequel, The Moon and the Face. Both of these are fairly brisk volumes. That's under 150 pages. And that is 150 pages exactly. So, 2 books done for 300 pages. I think for the Read What You Own challenge, that's pretty good value. Also, under 150 pages, but teeny tiny writing. This is more on the science fiction fantasy side of things, but R.W. McElworth's Tiltangle. Also, around the 150 page mark, The Pastel City by M. John Harrison, the greatest fantasy novel since Dune. Now this was 1971, so I'm not entirely sure how long Dune had been out by that point, so it may not be as bold a claim then as it is now, but we shall see. More science fiction fantasy and Avram Davidson's Rogue Dragon. Fantasy is, of course, going to be a benefit for my ongoing Project Rabbit Hole. I have here 2 books on Lemuria, both by Lynn Carter, The Wizard of Lemuria and Thongor of Lemuria. I'm beginning with my reading of books about Atlantis, and possibilities here include The King of the World's Edge by H. Warner Munn, The Lost Continent by C.J. Cutcliffe Hine, again Ballantine adult fantasy, and this is the book which does break my 250 page rule. This is around about 280, but I'll let that slide. The Tritonian Ring by L. Sprague de Camp, which is an Atlantis book, and The Magic of Atlantis, a anthology of Atlantis tales edited by Lynn Carter. So both of these books I mentioned on a tag recently. I can't remember which one. In previous Februaries, there has been a wasted weekend, a sort of sub-event of Garb August. I have some choices for that weekend if that event is running again. And I'm going to start with The Thief of Larn. So this is a sequel to Warrior of Larn by Gardner F. Fox. And another Gardner F. Fox, Kothar and the Demon Queen. I also have a book I would be reading if there is a wasted weekend, and in fact, if I read this book, it's going to count for a number of book events. It will be a wasted weekend, Garb August type book. It will be a film novelization. There is a film event happening in February, hosted by Annie at Obscure Book Adventures, Roy at Roy Reads Anything, and Duncan from Backaway from the Donkey. I mentioned this book in my Bangsian Fantasy video, and I mentioned it as being a pop culture modern-ish, relatively Bangsian fantasy, and said, well, if there was a book of that, I'd read it, confident that there wasn't one. There is. The novelisation of Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey. So this will count as a film novelisation for the film event. It will count as a Bangsian fantasy for my Project Rabbit Hole. It will count as trash for the wasted weekend. What it won't do is count towards my Read What You Own challenge, because I will be looking at the version on the Internet Archive, and therefore doesn't count as a book I own, which is unfortunate. I have Operation Chaos by Paul Anderson, another Bangsian fantasy, and this has some horror staples rather than fantasy. There is a witch and there is a werewolf, but it's a fantasy novel nonetheless. And I've got some more anthologies on the list as well. Mostly sword and sorcery, but not exclusively. Of Savage Heroes, Tales of Sorcery and Black Magic, edited by Eric Pendragon. And more Linkata this time. Flashing Swords, Volume 1. Flashing Swords, Volume 2. And finally, and I don't think I've really realised how short a month February is, but to tie in with the beginning of our reading of 1001 Nights, I also have more tales from the Arabian Nights, Arabesques. So this is an anthology of Arabian Nights type stories edited by Susan Schwartz, and including stories from Larry Niven, Gene Wolfe, Tanith Lee, Jane Yolen, Esther M. Freisner, Susan Schwartz, Andre Norton, Judith Tarr, Elizabeth Scarborough, William R. Fortune, Harry Turtledove, Melissa Scott, and M.J. Eng. So a fair few writers to get under the belt with some brisk short stories, and it looks like it's a bit of fun as well. There's still plenty of other stuff I want to read in February. Another issue of Planet Stories for my continuing deep dive into that series. A fantasy pulp to tie in with the fantasy event. A film pulp, there are plenty of those from the 20s, 30s and 40s that will tie in with the film event. It's still the winter of Wyndham, so maybe Chalky. That's a quick read. I'm not going to be short of choices. What I will be short of, as usual, is time. But I still have a little while to plan for this. I still have some of January left. Let's get some books read and give myself a little bit of confidence that I'm going to hit that 100 book target. Until next time.